The List, Chapter 7, by Patricia Forde. Number 82. Breath. Air in and out of lungs. The climb was not an easy one. They had just passed the roundhouse, the Gavers' base, when the path started to rise steeply. John Noah's building was right at the summit of the mountain, a half circle cut into the rock. Its back was made of stone, but the curved front piece was almost all synthetic glass. At night, when it was lit, it looked like a picture she'd seen in a book of an old-fashioned spaceship. Letta looked up at it to where it broke out of the mountain, towering above her. Her feet worked to find footing on the stony path, the pebbles and shale shifting as she walked. The higher they climbed, the stronger the wind became, until Letta was struggling to push against it. The Gavers walked behind her, giving her a none too gentle push each time she slowed. Her mind was racing. What could Noah want? If he knew about Marlowe, he would have had the Gavers arrest her. It couldn't be that. The rain had stopped, and Letta could hear the men breathing heavily behind her and the sound of a bird somewhere far above them, screeching as it flew, as if warning of some great misfortune. Letta realized they had arrived at the bottom of a long flight of stone steps. Carver shoved her, his rough hand on the small of her back. She stumbled, then righted herself and started up the steps. She looked up. They were approaching the house from the western side. She could smell the sharp tang of salt air. The ground leveled out. In front of her was a door set into the gable. To her left, a low hedge, and below her, far below her, the sea. She averted her eyes. Breathe, she told herself. Breathe. A Gaver leaned in past her and knocked on the door. They waited. Behind her, the Gavers mumbled something she didn't catch. The door opened abruptly. A woman stood there. She was tall and thin, vampire pale, and a sharp, angled face. Her hair was a gray bleached color, and Letta suspected that, released from its tight bunch, it would reach her waist. Amelia Deer. Everyone knew her. She worked for Noah, and people said she was the second most powerful person in Ark. She was also known as the woman with the breathing problem, and now Letta was up close to her. She could hear why. Amelia's breathing was like the sound of a punctured bellows. Her lungs had been damaged in a chemical explosion before the melting, or so Letta had heard the woman at the water station say. Up close, Letta could see that each breath was an effort for her, a slow sucking noise that made Letta shiver. Letta went through the door, and Amelia closed it, leaving the Gavers outside. A long corridor stretched out in front of her. Come, the woman said, and Letta followed her. Halfway down the corridor, Amelia stopped and opened a door. The room they entered was large and comfortable. A seat hung from a chain in the middle of the ceiling, and all around were soft chairs and tall, elegant candles that, when lit, would supplement the modest electric light. The far wall was entirely made of glass, or what looked like glass. Up close, Letta could see that there was a door embedded in the glass. Amelia opened it and gestured to Letta to step outside. Letta moved forward tentatively. She was standing on an enormous platform, a half circle bordered by a low wall of glass. As she stepped onto it, it felt as though it was swaying in the wind. She clenched her fists and looked up. A man stood against the wall, looking out beyond the house. John Noah. Letta registered that it must be him, but she couldn't concentrate on that. The wind was howling around her ears, and she felt dizzy. The man turned. Come, he said, in a high, sharp voice. She could hear just above the sound of the wind. She wanted to turn and flee to the safety of the house, but she had to do as he said. She felt as though she was on a tightrope, sure the gust of wind would pick her up and throw her over the edge. The floor was transparent, and through it she could see the teeth of the cliff. She wanted to lie on the ground, to close her eyes. She took 2 more steps forward. As she neared John Noah, she almost stopped breathing. The platform stretched out over the edge of the cliff and looked down on an angry sea. She could hear the waves below, feel the salt spit on her face. She felt the dizziness return. Are you all right? She could hear Noah as though he were miles away, his voice echoing through a tunnel. Her legs grew weak, and then his arms were around her. What's the matter? He said, and she could feel his breath on her cheek. I don't like heights, she managed to say. The truth was she was terrified of heights. She always had been. Noah took her arm. You poor child. He led her back to the safety of the room. She almost collapsed as he closed the door, shutting out the wind and the terrible vista outside. He lowered her onto a chair. I am so sorry, he said. I thought you would enjoy the view. I even asked them to be sure you brought your coat. He filled a glass of water from a jug that stood on the table. Here, he murmured, drink. She swallowed the cold liquid gratefully and felt better. Thank you, she stuttered. John Noah looked down at her. A tall, gangly man, he had deep-set, dark eyes and curly hair, brown, streaked with gray. He smiled at her. Better? She nodded. Was he talking list now? As though he could read her mind, he spoke. So, he said, sitting on the chair opposite her, you are our wordsmith. No need for us to speak list, then, is there? No, she said. I don't often get the opportunity to speak in the old tongue. I find it quite enjoyable. He picked up the jug and poured himself a glass of water. You must be wondering why I sent for you. Yes, she said. He frowned. I am afraid I have some bad news. Letta's thoughts raced. Bad news? Was he going to shorten the list again, or something worse? Why was he telling her and not Benjamin? It concerns your master, Benjamin Laszlo. Letta felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Her body went cold all over. Time had slowed down. Has something happened to him? She could hear her own words, but didn't recognize her voice. He looked up, and she knew she didn't want him to speak. She didn't want to hear the next thing he said. She pulled back in the chair, trying to put more distance between them, but there was no stopping him now. In slow motion, she watched his lips part. I am afraid he is dead, Letta. Dead, deprived of life, no longer living. The word fell from his lips like a grenade and then exploded in the air between them. Dead. Had he really said it? John Noah was on his feet. His lips were moving. A terrible shock. A great man. We go back a long way. Not Benjamin. Please, not Benjamin. Noah took her hand, helping her out of the chair. Listen now, Letta, he said. Listen, child. She forced herself to look at him, to concentrate on the words that were still pouring from his mouth. You are the wordsmith now, the only wordsmith we have. Do you understand? She nodded and looked away, but he took her chin between his thumb and finger and turned her face back to him. You have a great responsibility. Are you ready for this challenge? She nodded again. He seemed satisfied. I am sorry for your loss, he said, and left the room. She stood there a few minutes, feeling the heaviness that had descended on her. Never had she felt so alone. Benjamin was gone. The pain in her heart forced her to sit again. Benjamin. She barely noticed Amelia walking into the room. I'm sorry about your master. Her soft voice broke the terrible silence, speaking the old tongue like Noah. He was a great man and a great friend, and he played an important part in building Ark. You can be proud. Where? How? Letta tried to say the words, but it felt like they were lodged too tightly in her throat. Smith Fearful, the scavenger, found his body. He was savaged by wild animals, but Fearful recognized him. Savaged by wild animals. Where? Letta said, not looking at Amelia. South of the river in the forest. He was working there. We have some of his things, if you'd like to have them. Letta nodded and heard the woman slip quietly out of the room. Savaged by wild animals. Her head was beginning to throb. Could it be true? Was Benjamin really gone forever? She didn't think she could hear it. She could bear it. She tried to picture his face, his eyes, but there was nothing there. She almost panicked then. Why could she not picture him? She walked toward the window. Outside, it had started to rain again. The repetitive tapping of rain on the glass. The whistle of the wind outside. She couldn't bear any of it. She turned and found Amelia watching her. In her hand was Benjamin's familiar satchel. She almost ran across the room, banging her shin on the low table as she passed it. She grabbed the satchel, holding it close to her face. His smell filled her head, the smell of paper and wool and warmth. I'll see you out, the woman's voice cut through her thoughts. Letta nodded and followed her to the door. John Noah will want to see you soon to talk about your new work, Amelia said, and then the door was closed, and Letta found herself once more in the rain and wind. She turned slowly and walked back down the stone steps. By the time she reached the shop, it had grown dark. The nightlight had just come on, its quiet glow bathing the room in shadows. She sat down on the soft chair in the living area, Benjamin's bag on her lap. The leather felt warm despite the glaze of rain. She opened it, the clasp cold beneath her fingers. Inside were a half-empty water bottle, his tools, and a collection of odds and ends. She pulled out a label. It was made of some sort of plastic, and Sunshine Replacement Therapy was written on it. She knew it was old, but she had no idea how old. She thought they had all those words already, but maybe not. She would ask him later. Oh, no, she couldn't. Even as the thought flitted by, she was overcome by loneliness. Finally worn out, she lay in the big chair and fell asleep. In her dreams, she was in the middle of the ocean in a boat with silver sails. A warm summer breeze ruffled her hair, and she could feel the sun on her face. The waves beside her were small and flecked with white foam. Deep in the body of the water, words tumbled, one over the other. Mother, fish, step, summer. Tiny red words, bobbing and weaving. A cold breeze rushed by, and the sun dodged behind a cloud. She shivered. Something was wrong. The waves were getting bigger. She struggled with the sail, which had changed from silver to black. The rope cut her hands. She couldn't lose the boat, her father's boat. The wind was roaring, and the waves towered above her. She turned just in time to see a giant word rise from the foam. It was as big as a building, and for a second it hovered above her. Dead. She managed to read it just before it crashed down on her, sending her to the very bottom of the ocean. She woke screaming. The new day brought only more misery. She went to Central Kitchen, opened the shop, and transcribed words, all in a kind of numbness. Nobody mentioned Benjamin. Letta knew that people had been told, but too many people had died in the disasters. Nobody acknowledged death anymore. But there were little kindnesses, smiles of sympathy, warm glances. She knew they felt for her. She didn't need their words. Wilbur stopped by with her water allowance, and for once she was almost glad to see him. Mrs. Truckle came and brought her an apple. She said nothing about Benjamin, but Letta knew the older woman understood nonetheless. You wordsmith now, she said to her before she left. Not child, wordsmith. When she wasn't grappling with her her grief over Benjamin, Letta wondered what about Marlowe. She still hoped they might find Daniel. The healer's wife had stopped by in the afternoon to order words for their new apprentice, her face a mask of grief. Letta longed to tell her that Marlowe's friends were going to look for Daniel, but she knew she couldn't, so instead she sat and transcribed the words that they needed. Feverfew, lilac, rosemary, thyme. It was one of the longest lists that had to be prepared, and one of the most difficult. Letta worked on it all afternoon, glad of the distraction. The day dragged on. She couldn't eat, couldn't bear to think any more. She went into Benjamin's study and looked at the things on his desks. The things she had so carefully replaced after Carver's visit. The words he had been working on, his maps drawn in his own hand. The forest was a strange place, and very few people knew anything of its geography. She pulled one of the maps closer to her and examined it. She could see the official path along which the water pipe ran from the lake buried in the center of the forest. That was the road Benjamin took. It was patrolled regularly because of the water and was therefore considered reasonably safe. Beyond the path was the dense, dark forest, haunted by wild animals and, some believed, bandits. Benjamin had often told her that the greatest danger was the lack of food and water and the possibility of getting lost in there. She was about to put the map away when something caught her eye. A river. Benjamin had written the word clearly and underlined it. The river. She realized it meant something to her. Hadn't Amelia said they had found his body south of the river? But the river was miles from the official track. What had Benjamin been doing there? She looked at the map again. The river was nowhere near the main path. She knew Benjamin wandered off the path a little on his trips. If he found something interesting, he might go off in any direction, but he would never lose sight of the main road. So what had he been doing at the river? She felt that there was more she knew about the river, some other context. But when it come to her, they said a scavenger had found him, fearful. She was sure that was what they had said. She picked up a car and wrote it down, fearful. If he was a scavenger, he probably lived in Tin Town. She had never gone down there. Benjamin wouldn't hear of it. It was a lawless place, a place people avoided. And yet she wanted to talk to this man. He had found him. Surely he could tell her why Benjamin had been down there. Then another thought struck her. What had Fearfall been doing there? She frowned. None of it made any sense. Not for the first time. She wished she had someone to talk to, someone like Marlowe. It hit her like a thunderbolt. That was it. Marlowe. It was Marlowe who had mentioned the river. In the throes of his fever, he had talked about the desecrators and the pump house and the river. She wondered what Marlowe was doing. Had they found Daniel? Did he think of her at all? She sighed. All she had were questions. Benjamin had gone to a part of the forest that was both dangerous and off his normal route. A scavenger had come across his body, a scavenger who had no business in the forest. Was the scavenger lying? Had he murdered Benjamin and taken his bag? Why, then, would he go to Noah and tell him everything? She stood up and walked to the window. Where was his body now? She couldn't bear to think of Benjamin thrown to the animals. Was he cold? With all her heart she wanted to hold him in her arms, to wrap a blanket around him, to let him know he was not forgotten. Her dream came back to haunt her, and she shivered. She remembered what Marlowe had said. There's always truth in dreams. Don't you know that? We have to learn what they mean, that's all.